A billionaire returned to his hometown after 20 years, expecting to sign a land deal and leave before sunset. But on a lonely dirt road, he froze when he saw the only woman he had ever loved walking barefoot, carrying a massive bundle of firewood across her shoulders, while a little 4-year-old girl struggled beside her with tiny arms full of sticks. She looked exhausted, yet she refused to stop. What he discovered after following them would change both of their lives forever. Ethan Walker had flown into Charleston, West Virginia that morning in a private jet worth more than every house in the town he was about to visit. And for the entire 90-minute drive up into the hills, he told himself this was nothing more than a transaction. Sign the papers, shake the hands, get back on the plane before dinner. That was the plan his assistant had printed out for him, laminated, tucked into a leather folder on the passenger seat of the rented Range Rover. 400 acres of untouched forest land outside a town called Millbrook Hollow, a place so small it didn't even have a stoplight, a place he had spent 20 years trying very hard not to think about. He told himself he felt nothing driving past the old feed store, nothing seeing the church steeple poke up over the tree line, nothing when the GPS lost signal and the 2-lane highway narrowed into a road he used to walk barefoot as a boy. He told himself a lot of things that morning, and every single one of them turned out to be a lie the moment he came around the bend by Miller's Creek and had to stand on the brakes so hard the tires screamed against the gravel. There was a woman on the road ahead of him. She was walking with her back bent forward, under the weight of a bundle of split firewood, so large it looked as if it might fold her in half, the rope biting into her shoulders through a thin grey shirt gone soft and colourless from 100 washes. Beside her, matching her pace with the fierce concentration only a small child can manage, a little girl no older than 4 trudged along with her own armful of kindling, chin lifted, refusing to let a single stick fall. The woman's feet were bare on the sharp gravel, and even from 50 yards away through his windshield, Ethan could see the dark smear where her heel had opened up against a stone. She didn't stop walking. She didn't even slow down. She just kept climbing that hill like it was something she had done 10,000 times before, like pain was simply the toll she paid to get where she was going. Ethan sat frozen behind the wheel, his hand still gripping the gear shift, his heart doing something strange and painful in his chest, because even at that distance, even after 20 years, he knew exactly who she was. Grace Bennett. He had told himself for 2 decades that if he ever saw her again, it would be in some imagined version of the future, where he was already prepared for it, already composed, already able to say the things he had rehearsed 1,000 times in hotel rooms across the world. Instead, he was sitting in a rented SUV on a dirt road, with his mouth hanging open, watching the only woman he had ever truly loved carry firewood on her back like a beast of burden, while a little girl who could have been carved out of his own childhood photographs walked beside her. He should have called out. He should have thrown the door open and run to her. Instead, something old and cautious in him held the wheel steady, some instinct telling him that if he announced himself now, in this moment, on this road, he would never see the truth of her life. She would straighten her back and put on the mask people wear for old lovers who come back rich. So he did the only thing his mind could produce in that moment of shock. He waited until she and the girl disappeared around the bend, and then he eased the Range Rover forward, keeping his distance, following the woman he had promised 20 years ago that he would come back for. The road narrowed until it was barely more than a footpath, forcing him to leave the car behind a stand of sycamores and continue on foot, his $600 boots sinking into mud that had probably swallowed cheaper shoes for 100 years before he was ever born. He followed the sound of the little girl's voice, high and determined, carrying through the trees. "I'm strong, Mama. I can carry more. Let me carry more. You're carrying plenty, Lilybug. Don't you dare drop those or we'll be picking splinters out of your hands all night." The woman's voice hadn't changed at all. That was the thing that nearly broke him, crouched behind a fallen oak with his heart slamming against his ribs like a man half his age. 20 years, and Grace Bennett's voice still had that same warmth folded inside the exhaustion, that same way of turning a hard moment into something almost like a joke so a child wouldn't feel the weight of it. They came out of the trees into a small clearing, where a cabin sat with its roof patched in mismatched tin, no power line running to it, no well pump visible, just a hand pump beside the door and a stack of chopped wood taller than the child standing beside it. Grace lowered the bundle from her shoulders with a groan she tried to swallow, and Ethan watched her press both hands into the small of her back, watched her wince, watched her force a smile onto her face the second the girl looked up at her. "We did good today, huh?" Grace said. "We did real good," the girl agreed solemnly, and then she asked the question that put Ethan Walker on his knees in the wet leaves behind that fallen oak. "Mama, when's Daddy coming?" Grace's whole body went still. "Baby, we've talked about this." "I know. You said maybe someday. I just wanted to ask again." "You can ask me anything you want, Lily. Always." Grace knelt down in front of her daughter, brushed a strand of blonde hair from the girl's forehead, and for one unbearable second, angled just so in the afternoon light, Ethan saw his own mother's face looking back out of that child's features, the same slight tilt to the eyebrows, the same small birthmark behind the left ear that every Walker for 3 generations had carried, a little crescent of pale skin no bigger than a fingernail. Ethan sat back hard against the tree trunk, his mind doing frantic arithmetic. The girl looked about 4. 4 years ago he had come back to Millbrook Hollow exactly once, for 3 days, to bury his father. 3 days during which he had run into Grace Bennett at the only diner still open in town, and after 2 bottles of wine and 20 years of unspoken things finally spilling out between them, they had ended up back at his father's empty house, and neither one of them had ever spoken about that night again. He had left the next morning telling himself it had been a mistake born of grief, a closed door, a chapter that belonged to the past, and would stay there. He had never once imagined it might have opened a door to something else entirely. He didn't approach her that day. He told himself he needed to think, needed to be sure, needed to understand what he was walking into before he shattered whatever fragile peace Grace had built for herself and her daughter. So he drove back down the mountain in a daze, missed his land deal meeting entirely, and checked into the only motel in the county under a name that wasn't his own, because Ethan Walker showing up at the Hollow Inn would have been the biggest news the town had seen in a decade. The next morning he started asking questions carefully, the way a man does when he doesn't want word getting back to the person he's asking about. He started at the general store, where Deb Foster, who'd run the register since Ethan was in diapers, nearly dropped a case of canned beans when she recognized him. "Lord have mercy, Ethan Walker. I thought you were too rich to remember this place had a zip code." "I need to ask you about someone, Deb. Grace Bennett." The warmth drained out of the older woman's face so fast it was like watching a light switch flip. She glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice like the walls themselves might be listening. "You don't want to be asking about that around here." "Why not?" "Because that girl caused this whole county a world of trouble a few years back, and the people who got hurt by it don't forgive easy." Deb set the beans down and folded her arms. "You want the truth, or you want the story everybody tells?" "I want the truth." Deb glanced around the empty store one more time, then came around the counter and sat down heavily on an overturned milk crate, the way she used to sit when Ethan was a boy and she'd sneak him free candy after his mother passed. "You sure you want this, Ethan? Once you know, you can't unknow it, and knowing it around here has a way of making your life harder, not easier." "I need to know, Deb." "All right." She sighed, the kind of sigh that carried years in it. Grace Bennett used to be the sweetest, sharpest girl this town ever raised. Smarter than half the men who run things around here, and everybody knew it, which I think is part of why they let her fall so hard when the time came. Made it easier to look the other way if you already halfway resented her for being right about things. Deb told him what she knew, and what she knew was only the beginning of it. 5 years earlier, Grace had been working as an office clerk for a logging operation contracted by Sterling Timber and Land, the largest landholding company in 3 counties, run by a man named Robert Sterling, whose family had been buying up Appalachian mountainsides since before the Depression. Grace had noticed the paperwork didn't match the trucks. Permits for selective harvesting on protected slopes near the watershed, but the crews were clear-cutting whole hillsides, and worse, they were doing it on land the company didn't actually have the rights to touch, land that belonged to a conservation easement filed with the county 20 years before. Grace photographed the discrepancies, copied the falsified permits, and took everything to the county extension office, and then to a reporter at the regional paper. Within a month, she'd lost her job for cause, accused of embezzling petty cash from the office safe, a charge that somehow appeared in the county paper before Grace ever saw a warrant. Within 3 months, every business in 3 counties connected to Sterling Timber, which was most of them, had quietly stopped hiring her. Within a year, the reporter who'd taken her story had been transferred to another paper 2 states away, and the story itself had simply vanished, the way stories do when enough money leans against them. "She still tell people the trucks were doing something wrong?" Ethan asked. "She stopped telling people anything a long time ago," Deb said. "Girl just disappeared up into the hills with that baby of hers and started living the old way. Firewood, garden, sewing for whoever'll pay her in cash and keep their mouth shut about it. Pride's the only thing that woman's got left, and from what I hear, she'd rather starve than take a dime of sterling money or anybody else's charity." Ethan spent the rest of that day and half the night going through public records at the county courthouse, using a name and a smile that opened doors faster than his real name might have, given how carefully Sterling Timber seemed to have buried its own paper trail. What he found confirmed everything Deb had told him, and then went further. The falsified permits bore a signature that, when he compared it to older documents, didn't match the county surveyor's actual handwriting at all. Someone had forged a state official's name to authorize logging on protected land, and someone else, likely with far more money and far more reach, had made sure that fact never saw the inside of a courtroom. He spent hours in that courthouse basement, coat off, sleeves rolled up, dust from decades-old filing boxes settling on his $3,000 shirt, and somewhere around midnight, hunched over a folding table under a single humming fluorescent light, he found himself laughing out loud. A short, disbelieving laugh because he realized he hadn't felt this alive doing anything in a boardroom in 15 years. There was something almost sacred about it, digging through the truth by hand instead of having an assistant summarize it for him in a bullet-point memo. He thought about all the acquisitions he'd closed over the years, all the deals that had made him rich, and none of them had ever felt like they mattered the way this one did. Sitting alone in a basement in the town that raised him, trying to undo 20 years of damage, one forged signature at a time. He found something else too, buried in a property tax filing from 4 years back. A survey map showing that the exact acreage he had flown in to purchase, the 400 acres his own company was preparing to buy from Sterling Timber, bordered directly on the same disputed watershed land Grace had tried to expose. If he signed that deal, his own name and his own money would be handing Robert Sterling exactly what he needed to finish erasing the evidence for good, clearing the land, salting the earth on the whole story. He drove back up the mountain the next afternoon, not as a businessman this time and not in disguise. He parked at the edge of the clearing and walked the last 100 yards on foot, and when Grace Bennett stepped out onto her porch, with an axe still in her hand from splitting kindling, and saw who was standing at the edge of her yard, her whole face went through about 6 different emotions before it settled on something Ethan had never once expected to see aimed at him. Rage. "You've got some nerve," she said, her voice low and shaking. 20 years, Ethan. 20 years and not one letter, not one call, and now you show up on my land like you've got a right to be here? Grace. No. She came down the porch steps, axe still loose in her hand. Not a threat, just something she'd forgotten to put down. "You don't get to grace me. You left. You said you'd come back for me, and you didn't, and I spent years, actual years, checking the mail like a fool because I believed a boy who told me he loved me more than anything in the world. I know. I know what I did, and I'm not here to make excuses for it." "Then why are you here?" Behind her, the cabin door creaked, and Lily poked her head out, wide-eyed at the stranger in the yard, and Ethan felt his throat close up entirely. "Because I saw you on the road yesterday," he said quietly. "I saw you carrying wood on your back until your feet bled, and I saw your daughter Grace, and I need you to tell me the truth. I need you to tell me how old she is." Grace's face went white as bone. The axe slipped from her fingers and thudded into the dirt. "You get off my land," she whispered. "Grace, get off my land, Ethan Walker, before I make you regret coming back here at all." He left. He didn't argue, didn't push, because he could see that pushing any harder in that moment would break something in her that might never be put back together. But he didn't go far. He checked back into the motel, And the next morning he was back at the courthouse, this time pulling Lily's birth certificate, a document that listed the father as unknown, filed in a county where Ethan happened to know the clerk's late father had once coached him in Little League. A connection that got him a look at the record without a court order, quietly, off the books. The kind of favor small towns still traded in when money wasn't the currency being offered. The birth date told him everything. 9 months, almost to the week, after that night in his father's empty house. He drove back up that mountain a third time, and this time Grace was waiting on the porch like she'd known he'd come back, arms crossed, jaws set. "She's mine," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Grace was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the only sound in the clearing was wind moving through the tree line, and Lily's small voice singing something to herself around the side of the cabin. "I was going to tell you," Grace finally said. "I wrote you a letter, sent it to the address your father had before I even knew for sure. It came back unopened. Returned to sender. You'd moved on so fast, Ethan. Moved up so fast I figured you'd built yourself a whole new life that didn't have room in it for people like us." "There was never a life I built that didn't have room for you in it, Grace. Not one day of it." "That's a real pretty thing to say to a woman you didn't call for 20 years. "I know." He sat down on the porch step, not close to her, giving her all the space she needed. "I know it doesn't fix anything. I know money and apologies can't buy back the years you spent alone, raising a little girl who has my mother's exact same birthmark. But I'm here now, Grace, and I'm not leaving again, and I don't care what it costs me to prove that to you." Grace's eyes filled, and she blinked hard, angry at her own tears. "You think you can just walk back into her life? She's 4 years old, Ethan. She doesn't know you. She's been asking me for a year when her daddy's coming, and I never had an answer that didn't break both our hearts a little. You don't get to be the answer to that question just because you found a birth certificate." "Oh, you're right," he said. "I don't get to demand anything, but I'm asking, let me earn it, however long it takes." She didn't answer him that day. She told him to go, and he went. But this time he left a phone number on a scrap of paper tucked under a rock by the porch steps, and he didn't push again, not for 3 full days. Days he spent instead doing something he thought might actually mean more to Grace than any apology ever could. He went after Sterling Timber. It wasn't hard to find allies once people realized Ethan Walker's money was aimed in the opposite direction of Robert Sterling's for the first time in local memory. The reporter, who'd been transferred out 2 states away, a woman named Carol Whitfield, still had every original photograph Grace had given her, still had her old notes, and she'd been waiting 5 years for someone with enough resources to finish what she'd started. Carol met Ethan at a coffee shop in Charleston, arriving 20 minutes early and ordering nothing, a battered accordion folder of documents already spread across the table by the time he sat down. "I want you to understand something before we start," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I got run out of my own newsroom over this story. My editor got a call from somebody, never told me who, and 2 weeks later I was covering city council meetings in a town 4 hours from my kids' school. I've been waiting 5 years for somebody to care about this as much as I do, and I need to know you're not just some rich man's guilty conscience that's going to lose interest the second it gets expensive." "It already cost me a land deal worth $11 million, Ethan said. "I walked away from it the morning after I saw Grace on that road. I'm not losing interest, Ms. Whitfield. I'm just getting started." Something in her face eased just slightly, and she slid the folder across the table. "Then let's finish what she started." The county surveyor whose signature had been forged turned out to be retired but very much alive, and very much furious to learn his name had been used to authorize the destruction of land his own father had helped place under conservation protection back in the 1960s. A structural engineer Ethan hired within 48 hours confirmed from satellite imagery that the clear-cutting on the disputed watershed slope had already caused 2 minor landslides that the county had quietly attributed to weather events rather than illegal logging, landslides that had begun silting up the creek that fed half the farms in the valley below. Ethan didn't announce any of it. He simply began buying up the mineral and mineral-adjacent rights around Sterling Timber's disputed parcels through a shell company, cutting off Robert Sterling's ability to quietly finish the job before anyone could stop him, while Carol Whitfield quietly reopened her investigation with fresh legal backing and an engineer's report that couldn't be waved away as some environmentalist's fantasy. Robert Sterling found out who was buying up his margins by the fourth day, and he showed up at the motel Ethan was staying in with two of his sons and the kind of smile men wear when they think they're still the most powerful thing in a room. "Ethan Walker," Sterling said, settling into the chair across from him in the motel's empty little breakfast area without being invited. "Heard you were sniffing around my land deal. Didn't figure you for the sentimental type, coming back to save some little logging clerk's reputation." "I heard you were the sentimental type," Ethan said evenly, "sentimental enough to forge a state surveyor's signature rather than just pay for a proper permit." Sterling's smile flickered just barely. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a documented fact, Robert. I've got the original signature on file from 1987, and I've got your forgery from 5 years ago, and they don't match, and the man whose name you used is retired healthy and extremely interested in pressing charges. You think anybody in this county is going to take the word of some clerk you knocked up on the side over the word of a family that's owned half this valley for 4 generations? Something in Ethan went very cold and very quiet. "Careful," he said, and it wasn't loud, but it landed like a dropped anvil in that small breakfast room. "You destroyed a woman's entire life over 400 acres of timber, Robert. You forged government documents, you framed her for theft, you bought off a newspaper, and you let her raise our daughter alone in a cabin with no electricity while you drove around in a truck that cost more than her whole life savings. I'm not the sentimental type. I'm the type who just realized he has more money and more lawyers than you do, and unlike you, I've got 20 years of guilt that isn't going anywhere until I spend every dollar of it making this right." Sterling's sons shifted in their seats, but Sterling himself just studied Ethan for a long moment, the smile finally gone. "You'll ruin this whole county's economy chasing your guilty conscience. Half the jobs around here run through my company one way or another. Then maybe your company should have thought about that before it started poisoning the watershed those same jobs depend on," Ethan said. "You've got one chance here, Robert. Come clean, publicly, on the record, admit the falsified permits, pay restitution for the landslide damage, and clear Grace Bennett's name in writing. Or Carol Whitfield runs her story with the engineer's report and the forged signature comparison, and the county DA, who happens to owe my law firm a favor from a case in Charleston last year, opens a criminal fraud investigation into every permit Sterling Timber has filed in the last decade." Sterling stood up from the table without another word, buttoned his jacket, and walked out with his sons trailing behind him. But he stopped once at the door and looked back. "You know what happens to outsiders who come back here thinking they can rewrite how things work in this county, Ethan. They find out real quick this isn't Manhattan. Things get handled quiet around here, always have. I grew up 2 miles from where you're standing, Robert. I'm not an outsider. I'm just the first person from around here who ever had enough money not to be scared of you." That night, someone put a brick through the window of the rental Range Rover parked outside the motel. No note, no explanation needed. The next morning, Ethan drove up to Grace's cabin at first light to find the padlock on her woodshed cut clean through and half her winter supply of split logs scattered and soaked in the creek. Grace stood in the yard with her arms wrapped around herself, jaw tight, staring at the ruined woodpile that had taken her 3 weeks to build. "This is what happens," she said quietly, not looking at him. "This is exactly what happened 5 years ago. They don't come after you, Ethan. They come after everything around you until you're too tired and too scared to keep fighting, and then you just stop. I'm not going to stop. You don't know these people the way I do. You've been gone 20 years. I've lived under their shadow the whole time you were building skyscrapers. Then let me carry some of that weight for once, Grace. Please, just this once let somebody else be the one standing between you and them." She didn't answer him, but she didn't send him away either, and that, Ethan understood, was its own kind of answer. He spent that afternoon having a security company from Charleston install cameras around the cabin and the woodshed, over Grace's fierce objections about not wanting to feel like a prisoner in her own yard, and he spent that evening on the phone with Carol Whitfield, telling her it was time to stop waiting for Sterling to come around on his own. For 3 days after that, nothing happened publicly, and Ethan began to wonder if he'd overplayed his hand, if Sterling would simply dig in and let the whole thing become a years-long legal grind that Grace would have to live through all over again. But on the fourth day, Carol Whitfield's story ran anyway, because she'd decided she wasn't waiting on anyone's negotiation, and by the time it hit the regional paper's website that morning, it had already been picked up by a station out of Charleston, and by noon a producer from a statewide news outlet was parked outside the Sterling Timber offices asking questions nobody there had prepared answers for. Robert Sterling folded within 48 hours, not out of conscience, Ethan suspected, but out of pure arithmetic, the realization that a criminal fraud investigation would cost him vastly more than a public apology and a settlement ever could. He issued a statement admitting the falsified permits, admitting the office had mishandled internal accounting matters related to Grace Bennett's employment, which was corporate language for admitting she'd been framed, and agreeing to fund the watershed restoration and pay a settlement that, while it would never make up for 5 years of Grace's life, was enough to change everything about the years still ahead of her. Ethan drove up the mountain that evening with the signed settlement papers and Carol Whitfield's published story printed out in his hand. And he found Grace sitting on her porch step in the fading light, Lily asleep against her side, a candle burning in a jar beside them, because the sun was nearly down and she still had no power line to that cabin. "It's over," he said quietly, climbing the steps, sitting down a careful distance away. He admitted it, Grace, all of it. "It's in writing and it's already run in 3 different papers. Your name is clean. It's been clean since about noon today, and by tomorrow morning every person in this county who ever crossed the street to avoid you is going to know exactly why they should be ashamed of it." Grace stared at the papers in his hand, like she didn't quite believe they were real, her fingers trembling as she took them, reading Sterling's admission line by line in the candlelight, and when she got to the part where the company formally apologized for reputational harm caused to her, she made a sound that was half laugh and half sob and pressed the papers to her chest like she could absorb them straight into her heart. 5 years, she whispered. 5 years I told myself I did the right thing and it just didn't matter, that being right and being ruined were apparently the same thing in this county. And you just... "I didn't do this for you to owe me anything," Ethan said quickly. "I did it because it was right and because I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the 20 years I wasn't here, and this was the first real thing I could do that mattered." Grace looked at him for a long time, the candlelight flickering across a face that had aged 20 hard years, but still had the same eyes he'd fallen in love with as a boy. And finally, very softly, she said, "You could have led with just telling me you were sorry, you know. Didn't have to take down a whole timber company to say it. Would you have believed me if I'd just said sorry?" A small, tired smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. "No, probably not. That's why I did it the hard way." Lily stirred against her mother's side, blinking sleepily up at the stranger sitting on the porch step, and this time Grace didn't send him away. "Lily-bug," she said gently, brushing the girl's hair back from her face. "You remember asking me when your daddy was coming?" The little girl's eyes went round and wide, suddenly very awake. She looked at Ethan with the frank, searching stare only small children can manage, taking in his face like she was matching it against some picture she'd carried in her heart, without ever having seen the original. "Are you him?" she asked. Ethan's voice caught in his throat, 20 years and a fortune's worth of composure dissolving in an instant, in front of a 4-year-old on a porch step in the mountains. "I am," he managed. "And I know I'm real late, sweetheart. I'm sorry it took me so long." "That's okay," Lily said, with the effortless forgiveness only children have, the kind adults spend a lifetime trying to relearn. "You're here now." It wasn't a fix-everything moment, and Ethan didn't pretend it was. Trust, he understood now more than he ever had in 20 years of building companies and closing deals, wasn't something you settled in one conversation on a porch step. It was built slowly, the way Grace built a woodpile log by log, through winters that tested whether it would hold. He didn't move Grace and Lily into some mansion the next week. He didn't try to buy his way into being a father overnight. Instead, he rented a house down in the valley closer to town, modest by his standards but with running water and electricity and a school district Lily could actually attend, and he asked Grace, carefully, humbly, if she'd consider it. Not as a handout, but as a place they could figure things out from, together or apart, whatever she decided that meant. It took her 2 more weeks to say yes, and when she finally did, it wasn't because of the money or the house. It was because she'd watched Ethan show up at that cabin every single day for those 2 weeks, splitting wood alongside her, even though his hands blistered within an hour. Driving Lily to the county library 40 minutes each way, because the little girl had gotten hooked on a particular series of picture books, sitting up late into the night going over the details of the Sterling timber settlement with Grace, making sure every dollar was structured to protect her and Lily first, listening far more than he talked, and never once, not a single time, bringing up the 20 lost years as though she owed him credit for showing up now. By the time the leaves turned that October, the settlement funds had helped restore the eroded watershed slope, planted with saplings by a volunteer crew that included, on one particular Saturday, Robert Sterling's own estranged nephew, who'd quietly reached out to Carol Whitfield, wanting nothing to do with the family business anymore. Grace had gone back to finish the accounting certification she'd abandoned years before, this time with actual references willing to vouch for her, and the first week of classes, she called Ethan from the community college parking lot in Charleston, crying so hard he could barely understand her, just to tell him that the admissions officer had shaken her hand and said welcome back, like the last 5 years had never happened at all. Lily had a bedroom with electric lights that she insisted on turning on and off about 40 times a night, endlessly delighted by the miracle of a switch, and she started kindergarten that fall in a classroom with actual heat and actual other children her age, something she'd never had up on the mountain. And she came home the first day so full of stories about a boy named Tyler who'd shared his crayons that Grace had to remind her to breathe between sentences. There were hard nights too, because healing was never as clean as the story people liked to tell about it. There was an evening in November when Grace found an old photograph of the two of them from high school tucked in a box she hadn't opened in years, and she cried for an hour over everything those 20 years had cost them both. Time that could never actually be given back, no matter how much money Ethan had or how many wrongs got righted. There was a night Ethan sat alone in his rented house, replaying every version of himself that could have written one more letter, made one more phone call, driven back up that mountain just one time sooner, and he understood that some griefs simply had to be carried rather than fixed. But there were more good nights than hard ones, and that, Grace told him once, sitting on the porch of the rented house with mugs of coffee going cold between them while Lily chased fireflies in the yard, was probably the most honest definition of healing anybody was ever going to get. Ethan had learned slowly, painfully, and gratefully what it actually meant to keep a promise instead of just making one. He still ran his company. He still closed deals and sat in boardrooms and flew to cities most people in Millbrook Hollow would never see. But 3 weekends out of every month, without exception, he drove back up that same road where he'd once slammed on his brakes at the sight of a barefoot woman carrying firewood, and he split logs with Grace Bennett until his hands stopped blistering and started calluses, and he read picture books to a little girl with his mother's birthmark behind her ear. And somewhere in all of that ordinary, unglamorous work, something that had been broken for 20 years finally, quietly, began to heal. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath watching Grace carry that firewood up the mountain, or holding back tears when Lily asked if Ethan was really her daddy, then let us know down in the comments, because stories like this one remind us that some promises are worth the wait, no matter how many years pass in between. Hit that like button if you believe love can find its way back home. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story like this one, and turn on notifications because we've got so many more journeys of heartbreak, hope, and redemption waiting to be told. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and we'll see you in the next story.